Hello, everybody. I'm Mr. Abbott, and today I'll be talking about credibility and bias. And so, when I talk about credibility and bias, essentially I'm asking the question of how do you know what is true? Who do you know? How do you know who to believe? How do you know what facts to take as 100% correct and which ones are actually trying to mislead you? And to start you off, I want to show you this short movie that features the astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson.
How did America rise up from a backwoods country to be one of the greatest nations the world has ever known? We pioneered industries. And all of this required the greatest innovations in science and technology in the world. And so, science is a fundamental part of the country that we are. But in this, the 21st century, when it comes time to make decisions about science, it seems to me people have lost the ability to judge what is true and what is not. What is reliable, what is not reliable. What should you believe, what should you not believe? And when you have people who don't know much about science, standing in denial of it and rising to power, that is a recipe for the complete dismantling of our informed democracy.
Let us demand that educators around America teach evolution not as fact, but as theory.
An increasing number of parents showing skepticism about vaccinations.
Voters have approved a ban on GMOs.
Critics call climate change unproven science.
That's not the country I remember growing up in. Not that we didn't have challenges. I'm old enough to remember the 60s and the 70s. We got a hot war and a cold war, civil rights movement, and all of this was going on. But I don't remember any time where people were standing in denial of what science was. One of the great things about science is that it is an entire exercise in finding what is true. You have a hypothesis, you test it, I get a result. A rival of mine double checks it because they think I might be wrong. They perform an even better experiment than I did and they find out, hey, this experiment matches. Oh my gosh, we're onto something here. And out of this rises a new emergent truth. It does it better than anything else we have ever come up with as human beings. This is science. It's not something to toy with. It's not something to say, I choose not to believe E equals MC squared. You don't have that option. When you have an established scientific emergent truth, it is true whether or not you believe in it. And the sooner you understand that, the faster we can get on with the political conversations about how to solve the problems that face us. So once you understand that humans are warming the planet, you can then have a political conversation about that. You can say, well, are there carbon credits? Do we do this? Do we put a tariff on it? Do we fund? Do we subsidize? Those have political answers. And every minute one is in denial, you are delaying the political solution that should have been established years ago. As a voter, as a citizen, scientific issues will come before you. And isn't it worth it to say, all right, let me at least become scientifically literate so that I can think about these issues and act intelligently upon them. Recognize what science is and allow it to be what it can and should be in the service of civilization. It's in our hands.
And so, if you watch this, you'll see that Neil deGrasse Tyson is a big proponent of the idea that science is going to create the best version of what we believe is true. And to a certain extent, he's correct there. Oftentimes, people get confused because science never actually comes out and says that something is 100% true, because it always questions itself. It always leaves that room of doubt that something new can be found out as being true, and so it leaves itself open to being wrong. And this is really one of the hallmarks of somebody who's being completely truthful. They say that based upon everything they have in front of them, all the all the data that they have, that they are correct and that what they're saying is true. However, they also acknowledge that if something were to come along that changes what they know, that they could be found wrong at some point in the future. And so really that kind of humbleness with information is one of the things you want to look for when looking for how to determine whether or not somebody is being truthful. And so in this class, we're primarily concerned with whether or not what you're reading is actual fact or truthfulness. And really, what's going to happen when you're reading is you're going to find one of three things. You're either going to be reading news, opinion, or propaganda. And it's important to distinguish between those three things because news does something very different than propaganda does, and opinion does something that's in between. Opinion can sometimes be much closer to news. Opinion can also be very close to propaganda. And so if we look at what news is, as far as truthfulness, news works to have the best and most well verified facts. And so if something is news, it's trying to find out based upon what we believe is right, the facts that are in the report. Typically, news serves the public good. It works to bring enlightenment to people. Uh, as far as balance goes, it'll show different sides of an issue. It tries to show them equally. And so, if something is news, it shouldn't just be one sided, it should be showing two sides equally. Uh, News always works to be unbiased. And if a news report finds that they made an inaccuracy in what they were reporting, it'll work to correct that mistake. It won't deny that a news agency won't deny that they've made a mistake. They'll be open and transparent with the fact that they've misinterpreted information and try to correct that. Now, when we're looking at opinion pieces, instead of presenting facts, opinion is more interested in interpreting facts. It's more interested in telling you what those facts mean and how they will impact you as a person. This can be very useful. And this can be, depending on the author, very close to news because it'll be very fact based, or it can be very close to propaganda where it'll use lies and misinformation. As far as independence, typically a opinion piece will serve whatever the author's purpose is. It can be as balanced as the author. Some authors are very balanced. Some authors are going to be very one-sided. As far as the bias goes, it's once again author dependent, and accountability. Some authors will take accountability for being wrong, other ones will not. And so it just depends on what you're looking for. If you want to see somebody who is closer to news, they're more likely to have the general public good in their mind when they're writing. As far as propaganda goes, though, propaganda really feeds on misinformation and disinformation. And so they might give you the wrong information, or they might willingly mislead you. If they have a piece of information, they might not give you all the facts about it to make it look like it's more important than it actually is. Typically, a piece of propaganda serves some kind of larger group or organization. Propaganda works in favor of a political group or corporation or something of that nature. Propaganda tends to be pretty one-sided. It looks for only for the sorry, it looks only at the it only looks out for the interests of the organization that it's serving. And so, for instance, you'll see many political parties will use propaganda, and their propaganda is only to serve their party. It's not to help anybody else. Uh, the propaganda is openly biased. It doesn't make any claim that it is anything but biased. Although recently there have been some places that are clearly biased that claim to be unbiased to make themselves not look like propaganda. And typically, propaganda will deny mistakes or inaccuracies. So if they make a mistake with their information, they're going to deny that they made the mistake, and then they might continue to perpetuate that mistake if it's beneficial for their cause. And so, even though they're wrong, even though they're misleading you, propaganda will continue to tell you that they're right, and that anybody else who is telling you otherwise is lying to you. And so, how do you know if you have something that's news, opinion, or propaganda? Well, you got to figure out what the credibility is of your author. And so, this is the quality of being trusted or believed. And so, as you kind of read articles and explore the world of information, you're going to find that some people are credible and some people are not. Their authors are going to build up a a reputation of being credible or not. And those authors who are credible and have built a credible reputation go out of their way to keep it. And so before listening to an author, you should really determine whether he or she is credible in the first place. And so some of the ways you can do this is you can look for what's called a bias. And so a bias is a slight preference for one thing over another. It can be actually a large preference for one thing over another, but typically it's just a slight preference. And it can be really problematic if the author has a conflict of interest. So, for instance, imagine these articles, right? Imagine you're reading The Amazing Health Benefits of Eating Beef, and it's written by the Cattle Ranchers of America. Well, the Cattle Ranchers of America are going to have a bias towards getting people to eat meat. So you can't really believe what they're telling you because they are going to benefit if you believe them. And so that shows kind of a conflict of interest, and typically it shows a bias. Um, if you were to read Apple Magazine and read an article on how the iPhone 12 will change your life, that's going to show a conflict of interest. The Apple Magazine wants you to buy this phone. They have a bias towards you buying the phone. And they don't want you to go buy the competitors. And so this is something you want to look out for when you're reading as to whether or not an author has a bias. And I put this cartoon here because typically people will notice bias in other people. Typically what's going to happen is people will notice bias in the people they don't agree with. If you're listening to somebody you do agree with, you won't notice how biased they are because they're really kind of serving your purpose. And so this is one of the things that we need to be careful of as people, is that even if somebody is agreeing with us, it doesn't mean that they're unbiased. In fact, what can happen is the way that people get biased is they only listen to people who agree with them, and they kind of stop listening to the other point of view. So some biases to watch for. Some people have racial biases. They prefer one racial or ethnic group over another. Some people have political biases where they're a member of a political party and they are biased against the opposite political party. Some people have sexual or gender biases where they prefer or have a slight preference for certain genders or sexualities. Some people have age biases, and I'm sure a lot of you have found this where you'll find that maybe older people don't believe you or they don't listen to what you say because they see your age as a disadvantage or they see your age as a lack of experience. And so they're biased against you because they believe that because of your young age, you wouldn't have information or something to add. There's also class bias, and that's based upon your social standing, whether or not somebody will believe you. And there's one bias that's not like the rest that I have listed here, and that's what's called a confirmation bias. And so a confirmation bias is really kind of tricky. And so this is when people are going out of their way to find information that agrees with them. So everybody has something that they already believe. So they will have some kind of thought in their head that they believe is true. They will go out of their way to find the information that confirms what they already believe, and they'll go out of their way to avoid information that counters what they believe. And this is what's called a confirmation bias. So if you see somebody only looking for the facts that agree with them, you might be finding that you're running into a confirmation bias there. And so here's a quote by our president, Donald Trump, saying he's the least racist person you have ever interviewed. And so this is another, example of maybe somebody who is not aware of their own biases and they have a strong self bias. And I'm sure to Donald Trump, he has a strong confirmation bias where everything he says that proves this, he pays attention to. Everything he says that denies this, he ignores. And so that would be an example of him using a confirmation bias to form his own opinion of himself. And it kind of leads to a skewed perspective. And so here are some questions you can ask right off the bat to figure out whether or not an author is going to be credible before you even read a word that they've written. If you look up the author's background, you can ask yourself, what is this author's education level? It's not always a clear indication, but typically people who have studied in a field will have more information about that subject. Does he or she have a degree? From what school and what subject? What is the author's previous writing experience? How much does the author probably know about the topic or topics he or she is writing? Does he or she deal intimately with this subject in daily life or has only researched it for the purpose of writing about it? So if somebody is studying a topic every single day of their life, they're going to have information that might not be available to other people. And they're going to have a lot more experience thinking about that topic. If relevant, has he or she performed experiments or independent research on the topic? And does the author have a neutral perspective on the subject matter, or are they trying to promote a particular viewpoint? And remember, when somebody's trying to promote a particular viewpoint, they're leaning more towards propaganda. And it's not necessarily bad to read propaganda, but you should always be aware of propaganda when you see it. And so when you're reading an actual text, to determine if it's credible, you want to use this acronym, OPVCL. It stands for Origin, Purpose, Value, Content, and Limitations. And so origin, one of the questions you want to ask is, where is this source from? Who produced it? How was it produced and when was it made? If a source is really old, it might not be valuable anymore, especially when you're looking at scientific papers. Or anything related to kind of politics or culture, the older a paper is, the less valuable it can become. Now, if you're not familiar with news and news agencies, it's not really hard to find information and charts like this one that can really kind of map uh, uh, the publishers of information and how reliable their information is. And so in this chart, you could see going from top to bottom, you can see that the most factual pieces of information are at the top of the chart. And so those are the ones that contain the most correct facts. People have looked, double checked, made sure that their facts are accurate. As you move down the list, the facts don't necessarily become less accurate, but more opinion is mixed in. Once you get down to the very bottom, at that point, you're getting to oftentimes websites or sources that are straight up lying to you. They are misrepresenting their information. They're sometimes fabricating information, or they're portraying information in a way that is really misleading. And so towards the bottom of this chart, you're going to see more of what would be considered propaganda. Towards the top of the chart, you're going to see what more is considered news. And in between those two is more of the opinion pieces. And so that's one way to kind of read this chart. This chart also goes from left to right. And so on the far left, what you're going to see is really, those are sources that have a strong liberal bias. And so those pieces are going to usually try to promote some kind of a liberal ideology. If you go more towards the right of the chart, you're going to see sources that have a strong conservative ideology, and those would be more of they're serving as a conservative propaganda. And so if you're not really familiar with news sources, you can almost always find some kind of chart like this that will tell you where on the scale it is. And pretty much if you get anything towards the middle here, you're going to be fairly good. You're going to be getting fairly good information. You just want to be careful when you get really far over here to the right are really far over here to the left or really close to the bottom. And that's where you're going to get kind of misleading information. And so if you're looking for the origin of your piece, it may help to research the publisher and who it is that they are and what their reputation is as far as truth. Next thing you want to look at is the purpose. And so what does the author want the reader to do? And so if the author is taking the effort to write this article to a group of people, what do they want from you? Do they want you to learn something? Do they want you to change a belief or an opinion? Are they trying to get you to support a cause or a party? Or are they trying to get you to abandon support for a cause or a party? Uh, all of these things can be beneficial. They all can be truthful. It's just a matter of whether or not you recognize what it is they're trying to do and ask yourself whether or not they are being truthful in doing this. You may also ask, who is this made for? Once again, this is going back to the audience. Who is the audience of this piece? Who is the author writing to, and why are they writing to that audience? Why do they want to reach that audience in particular? And do any of these purposes show a bias? So if they're trying to get you to support a party or cause, you may ask, is there a rival to that party or cause? And if there is, they may be biased away from that party or cause. Sometimes people are very justified, right? Sometimes they're trying to get you to abandon a cause that may be misleading. And so an attempt to get you away from that isn't necessarily biased as much as it is just attempting to help with a kind of harmful entity. Looking at C, content, just ask yourself, what facts are offered in this piece? What are the pieces of information that are being put forward? And then ask yourself, are these facts accurate? And can you find reliable sources reporting the same thing? So can you go to the Associated Press and find a article about the same thing? You can go online and you can find a Wikipedia page on the Pacific Northwest tree octopus. There's a website devoted to the Pacific Northwest tree octopus. But if you try to find another website that talks about the same thing, you'll find that it's not there because this website was purposely made as a fake piece of information. And so the key here, though, is can you find other reliable sources reporting the same thing? If you can only find what I would call as I don't want to say fake news because I hate that term, but if you find kind of radical news sources reporting something and then you find the same information on another radical news source, that doesn't mean it's true. That just means that they're sharing the same misinformation. But if you go to a reliable news source and you find the same piece of information, then you know that the piece that you're looking at or the information you're looking at is probably more truthful. Looking at V, ask yourself, what is the value of this piece of text that you're reading? Is it for serious information? Is it just for entertainment? Can it only be used for propaganda? And who is it useful for? Who could use this information the most? And then finally, this is a really important one. The last one, last but not least, is the limitations. Ask yourself, what is this text not telling you? What information is it leaving out? And why is it not telling you that information? And then ask yourself, are there biases at work here in the information they are or are not giving you? And so I'm going to leave you with this kind of chart here. I don't want you to think of credibility as a yes or a no. Somebody is credible or not credible. They may be very credible or they may not be very credible, but very often somebody is going to be somewhere in between. And so if you're just trying to put them into two categories, that can be very hard. So think of it more of a spectrum. There are sources that are very credible and there are sources that are not very credible. And somebody oftentimes will be somewhere in between. Don't just try to make it two baskets. You can think of it as very credible, mostly credible, somewhat credible, not very credible, somewhat incredible, and then mostly not credible, and then not very credible, going on a spectrum from one side to the other. And if you need help remembering the term credibility, you actually use this term a lot. And I know this might be a new word for a lot of you, where you look at somebody's credibility, but you actually use this term a lot. You use it in the form of the word incredible. I know you've all heard incredible. Incredible literally means not credible. So it's the prefix in plus credible. And so when you're saying something is incredible, what you're saying is, I literally don't believe what I'm seeing. And typically the connotation is you don't believe what you're seeing in a good way. But just remember that incredible means not to be believed. And I think that can help you remember the term. Let's take a look at your assignment. Okay, and here we are looking at the sheet that you're going to fill out your assignment on. And so the goal of this assignment is you're going to read 2 news articles. And so what you want to find out is whether or not what you're reading is actually news, or if it's an opinion piece, or if it's straight up propaganda. And for each of those 2 pieces, you're going to do this by using the OPCVL. And so first, before you even, after you read the article, before you start filling out OPCVL, you want to take a little look, see if you can Google the author, and put the text title and author here, and just tell me what information can you find about the author. Who is this person who wrote this piece of information? And so once you're done with that, you're going to go through and you're going to write the different questions that are related to the letters of OPCVL. Here are the origins. So where did this source come from? Who's the publisher? Who wrote or created it? Are they an expert in the topic? And is this information up to date? Purpose. Why did the author create this source? What do they want? Who is the intended audience? Content. What is the general topic of this piece? What facts does it contain? And can the facts be corroborated through reliable sources? That means, can you find somebody else who is telling you the same thing? Can you find somebody who's reliable who's telling you the same thing? You can always find somebody else who's telling you the same thing, but can you find somebody reliable? Values or value. What can this piece be used for? Is it just news? Is it opinion? Is it propaganda? Who is this piece? Who would find this piece most useful? And then finally, limitations. And this is really important. What is this text not telling you? Why is this text leaving out this piece of information, and what biases are revealed by these omissions? When you're done, I want you to get an overall feeling of whether or not you believe this text is credible or not very credible. And you'll write your explanation and your reason why at the bottom of the document. You're going to do this for 2 different articles. If you want to try it, you can go purposely seek out a piece of news that you think is unreliable. So you could go back to that chart that I showed you on the video that has, kind of the less reliable news websites, and you can go and seek out one of them and read their articles to see if you can tell whether or not a unreliable piece of news is actually unreliable. I would never want to willingly or knowingly send you to one of those websites, but just if you do read something in one of those websites and you're like, I don't know, Mr. Abbott, this seems pretty credible. I think I'm convinced that the world is flat based upon reading this. Just come talk to me really quickly first before you change too many of your worldviews about what you think is real. And maybe I will read the article too and see if you're on to something, or I can show you something maybe you don't see. There's always a danger inherently by going and seeking out misinformation. So yeah, you're going to choose 2 articles and you're going to fill out one of these sheets for each of them. In the end, what you're going to do is you're going to write whether or not you feel the article could be considered credible or not. And so this will be due. There's an information sheet on the assignment that tells you the due date, and it'll be turned in through Google Classroom. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know when we come back to class. Otherwise, enjoy and good luck on the assignment.